it feels like there's like a whole class of folks out there that worked at newspapers in Alaska during the glory days and are sad that the newspapers aren't what they were during the glory days, and kind of stand on the sidelines and throw rocks at us and aren't necessarily like doing a lot to help us reimagine things. And I want to grab some of those folks who are complaining about the outlook and the present by like the lapels and shake them and say, like, join us, like, come stand on the line and figure it out. Complaining about it doesn't really do a whole lot.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is journalist Nathaniel Herz. Nat is a freelance reporter who spent over a decade working in Alaska, including stints at the Anchorage Daily News and Alaska Public Media. A few years ago, he started his own newsletter, Northern Journal, where he is supported by individual donors and grant funding to do his own reporting in collaboration with various media organizations like ProPublica, Anchorage Daily News, and Alaska Public Media. He also has a podcast called Northern Journal as well. Nat is on the show today because he wanted to provide a counter perspective to the doom and gloom attitude present in some of my recent episodes discussing the future of media in Alaska. Nat Herz, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm pleased to join the list of distinguished guests, including like District Court Judge Sharon Gleason and retired ADN publisher Pat Doherty. I'm definitely, I would say, of that judicial caliber.
Tell us about your early life. Where are you from?
I grew up mostly in Maine and would summarize my upbringing as like pretty standard East Coast guy who went to liberal arts college and spent time outside. The thing that brought me to Alaska was cross-country skiing and ski racing. I was like pretty obsessed with that, still kind of obsessed with it, and had been living in New York City after grad school, and was looking for a place that would be like great outdoor access and cross-country skiing specifically, but also not like a total career suicide backwater kind of place. And it just kind of worked out that the Anchorage Daily News was hiring right around that time, and managed to get a job.
What year was that?
2013.
2013. Growing up, had you always been interested in journalism?
Not really. I have it on both sides of my family, actually. My mom worked as a public radio reporter and now actually is a politics and democracy editor at this like national organization called The Conversation. They publish like analysis pieces by scholars, and she's incredibly accomplished. My stepdad is a retired newspaper publisher. On my dad's side, my grandmother graduated from the Columbia Journalism School in 1930. But weirdly, it just was not, no one was like pushing it on me. It just was sort of a thing I got into like in college. Someone encouraged me to do it, and I just kind of worked for the newspaper, and it just sort of seemed like the only thing that was interesting enough as a job. So I tried it. And
so no pressure from your family to be a journalist. Why were you interested in journalism?
I think I'm just like a pretty social and curious guy. And so it just is it's a great sort of pretext to be able to kind of exist in the world and ask questions that come up as you exist in the world and might want to learn more and know more about stuff. And I don't know, I don't really see like a better job out there, like I get to travel and go into unfamiliar, interesting spaces and meet new people and learn about their lives well enough to hopefully be able to explain them to other people. And getting to do it in Alaska, like Alaska is the most, as I'm sure all the people who are listening to your podcast would agree, Alaska is the most interesting place in the world. And so, getting to do this job here is like, yeah, it's awesome.
So something that's come up a lot as I started to do this media series is that journalism in general, but in Alaska in particular, is a young person's game, mainly because the way journalism has evolved over the past couple of decades is that it doesn't pay a lot of money and that it's really hard work, and that people sort of graduate out of journalism into a higher paying job. And we've seen that recently with Emily Goody-Kuntz leaving the ADN, with Sean McGuire leaving the ADN, with Tom Hewitt leaving the ADN. that that at a certain point in your life you need to be able to make money. You have taken a different approach than them because you managed to stay in journalism and leave the ADN. Can you just talk about a little bit of that trajectory of like how long you were at the ADN and how you decided how you were going to basically figure out your path in journalism in this century?
Yeah. So I moved to Alaska for a job at the ADN in 2013. I stayed there 5 years. I stayed there under three different ownership groups. When I got there, the paper was owned by national corporate chain McClatchy. They had been kind of investing after a long period of kind of decline and reductions to kind of match some of the competition that they were facing from KTU Channel 2 and also from this, startup Alaska Dispatch News. Then Alice Rogoff bought the paper for an eye-watering sum of money, led it through a period of investment where I really got to kind of benefit from bigger travel budgets. I spent a bunch of time down in Juneau, covered 4 legislative sessions. Then Alice Rogoff, for whatever reason, did not seem to have the money to continue spending on the paper. The paper went bankrupt. The Binkleys bought it, laid off a third of the staff. I was not laid off, but I watched some of my mentors and dear friends get let go for reasons that I did not totally understand at the time. I just like would name Rich Maurer, who was like for decades a investigative reporter and editor at the Daily News, who really was maybe the most influential person in my career as a colleague and as an editor. He was laid off, and at that point it was like, okay, we're still kind of doing the same amount of work, but there are a third fewer people around. And I just was pretty burnt out at that point and took a job at Alaska Public Media, worked there. I was going to cover like environment and energy, but then COVID happened. So I did kind of both of those things for about 3.5 years, and then kind of felt like I'd sort of made the most of that time and place, and went back to the Daily News for what I thought was going to be sort of a maybe slower paced like opportunity to do like some deeper dives, do some different things. But then Don Young died and kind of all hell broke loose in the political space, and had some cool opportunities there too. But it just sort of felt like I could not spend the rest of my life on a treadmill of Daily News, and not so much through the fault of the Daily News. I just think like, looking at the outlook for the industry and what is needed for sort of survival and existence at like a daily newspaper. So I did something that was felt pretty crazy. I like left that new job at the ADN after 6 months, rafted the Grand Canyon, went to Japan, like broke up with my girlfriend, did all kinds of just different stuff. And at the end was sort of like, okay, this Substack thing, like I'm not done with journalism. The Substack thing seems like kind of a thing. And so sort of launched Northern Journal November of 2022, was not making anywhere near the amount of money I would need to like pay the mortgage at that time, but also did about 1.5 years of contract investigative project work for Alaska Public Media, which really allowed me to do enough work and make enough money to pay the bills until Northern Journal really got to a place where it was sustainable. And now I have 650 roughly paying members, about 4,000 total people who receive the newsletter, and have also been able to get some pretty robust grant funding that's allowed me to hire a mostly full-time correspondent who covers the mining industry. So it's working for me for now. I don't know that this is the model that is going to work for everyone in the future. I don't know that it's the silver bullet to the, challenges that afflict the media business these days. But, incrementally, I think it helps. And it's, afforded me the opportunity to do work that feels really meaningful, and that I think at least incrementally advances Alaskans' understanding of like the place that they live and our kind of government functions and that kind of thing.
So I noticed that you had an employee because you sent me some pieces to read prior to the interview, and one of them was by the employee about the uranium mining on Seward Peninsula. And I thought two things that I thought was really great about that. Number one, I've interviewed a lot of authors, not really a lot of journalists, but a lot of authors, but they've never sent me someone else's work to read. So I appreciated that. But I think it's unusual when people do a Substack or going to do their own thing, their own sort of independent journalism, for them to hire someone else. So at what point did you think that you had the capacity and the budget to hire somebody else to do the work? It just seems like most people in your position would just be like, well, I'll just write more myself and I'll pay myself more money.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I think Max is an incredibly talented, dedicated, egoless dude. And he kind of approached me at a certain point and was sort of expressed some interest in doing some freelance work. Did a couple stories that I sort of paid him out of pocket for. And then we kind of were like, okay, maybe let's see if we can raise some money to pay you. So I think that kind of ultimately yielded a really great working relationship with the Wilberforce Foundation, which has basically funded his work for the past year or so. And so I would be clear, I'm not really, there's definitely cost and time associated with working with him, but it's not like I'm really pulling money out of my pocket to put into his. So it's definitely, not as self-sacrificing as you might think. If someone gave me $500,000, I could figure out how to spend it and use it as Northern Journal. And I think, there's like, I definitely, and I think anyone working in the media business in Alaska or probably anywhere could say, if you gave me more resources, here's how I'd use them. And I definitely, have my own vision of where like the holes are. And it felt like, Max was someone of talent and intellect who really could be thrown at an area that was not getting a lot of coverage, which was the mining industry. And it seemed like there was interest in that kind of work and also money for it. And so it just kind of materialized.
So that's Max Graham. So I want to talk more about North Carolina Journal and, what you guys focus on and what your issues are. But before that, I want to bounce back to the ADN because you did send me the story covering the slap that you received from a senator, I think in 2015, when you were covering the legislature. And that's a famous moment. And so I guess, can you talk about that moment when you were interacting with freshman Senator David Wilson at the time and how that came about and what happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sent that less because I felt like, oh, this is like, a hugely defining moment in my career, and more just sort of like, this is like the shit that reporters have to deal with sometimes. And I think like for me, it's like, that's just like more of an example of like, we do.
Tell it that way, under the rubric of working in the Capitol and covering Juneau.
Totally. I mean, I think it's like, and I will actually preface it by saying that like David Wilson and I have like a totally decent working relationship. I like the guy. But I think Alaska more so than certainly more than like kind of East Coast urban places, other more urban places, like, people just like don't really know what we do, how we do it, why we do it, even in a space like the Alaska Capitol. Like you might recall coverage of like David Wilson basically unseated Lynn Gaddis, not unseated, she was leaving her House seat to run for the Senate. And, everyone expected that primary to be a shoo-in, and she lost to this guy from the Wasilla City Council who signed his name on official documents with like a smiley face. And so it's like, okay, this is a guy dealing with, and like there was clearly like a story that was developing where it appeared that he was proposing legislation that would have sort of benefited his employer or punished a competitor to his employer, which was a nonprofit. I think both were nonprofits, but nonetheless. And it was like, I'd tried to get him to talk to me any number of times, like previously in the legislative session. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to talk for this story. And so like I ran into him in the hallway and was like, dude, like what, okay, I wrote this story. Like, what did you make of it? And instead of like having a normal conversation, he just like slapped me across the face, which is like, not, he didn't break my face, but it was like, okay, bro, this is not, totally normal. What I think societally we would accept as normal behavior, professional workplace behavior. The Capitol is like, it's a hard spot,
And did Mia Costello witness the slap?
She, I think, maybe heard the slap, certainly like stumbled across me trying to figure out in the moment like what to make of this. And yeah, so I mean, we decided that the best response to that was like, okay, what do you do when someone commits a violent act, even if it's not a serious violent act? And I reported it to the police, it was investigated, and just like, ultimately like a huge distraction from my work. Like, I'm just a guy showing up there trying to do a job. And I think at some level, like, this is not like the kind of challenges, like there are other unique to Alaska challenges that reporters face in doing their job. Like this is, it's like you're sleeping on 30-year-old mattresses in a school gym where there's no running water. And like, that's a challenge that's unique to Alaska. But I also think, and maybe this is not a challenge that's necessarily unique to Alaska, but it's just like it can be a hard environment. It can be a grind. And people are not always respectful. I think people carry a lot of like preconceived like notions about who the media is, what we do, why we do it. Again, I think David Wilson would tell you like he probably didn't know what I was doing and why I was doing it, and it probably made him uncomfortable. And it was like his easiest response was just like avoidance. And then whatever, I don't know why his sort of anxiety manifested in this way, but I think like over time, he would tell you like he learned that I was a guy who would like keep my word and was trustworthy and would keep his stuff off the record if it needed to be off the record. And like you learn, but sometimes there's actually like quite a lot of education that is involved with our jobs in sort of teaching people the kind of way that trade works because they might not know because they're not used to working with us.
I think I just did an interview with a lawyer from Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and I talked about it with him about Northwestern University. They had a study that showed that over half of the counties in America today are lacking a local news source. And then you use that study as sort of a background for the study that came out of Tulane and George Mason University that showed when you don't have a local news source, that corruption in local government went up by 6.9%. And that's just of cases that were being prosecuted. That doesn't account for the number of cases that never got reported because no one was looking. And so I think when I think about the story that you were just telling about potentially doing a bill that would hurt a competitor and help your former employer, yeah, somebody needs to be looking at that and asking those questions so that those sorts of bills don't pass.
I think one, it is easy to do a lot of hand wringing like about the state of media and how hard the media business is. It's also sort of easy to say Alaska is, the biggest state in the union and it's impossible to cover. And so of course there are going to be all these holes and we need to do something about it, especially given like the decline in the size of the Anchorage Daily News, other newspapers around the country. Like the flip side of that is like we have 28 public media stations across the state, and those are tremendous assets and like are staffed by incredibly hardworking, dedicated, nonpartisan, like professional folks. And they are like churning out news and showing up at the meetings and doing the work. And I also think like the mainstream legacy media outlets in Alaska are also continuing to like show up and do the work. Like I know, you and Pat on the podcast you did a couple of days ago, like I think talked about sort of how it feels like there's not a huge presence of legacy media in the capital, but like ADN for the past several years has had Sean McGuire like
and Ira, and I didn't mention it.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Iris is there as well.
Right. So they've had Sean McGuire there like full-time living in Juneau. Iris will come down.
Iris Samuels. Yeah,
Iris Samuels. Thank you. And then they'll send a photographer down. And I think, they'll even like, point some of their Anchorage folks at political stories if they intersect with other beats. I do accept that like the Anchorage Daily News is not what it once was. It's not what it was during the 80s and 90s during the newspaper war. It's not what it was when I worked there just by like virtue of numbers and people leaving. But I also think that like there is a lot of energy and talent and creativity and time being invested in like thinking about future iterations of media in Alaska that are sort of going to get at some of the challenges that the industry faces. And I think I get frustrated. There's like a whole sort of, it feels like there's like a whole class of folks out there that worked at newspapers in Alaska during the glory days and are sad that the newspapers aren't what they were during the glory days, and kind of stand on the sidelines and throw rocks at us and aren't necessarily like doing a lot to help us reimagine things. And I mean, like, if I don't feel like I have anything to complain about, right? Like, I'm making a decent living doing what I want to do, having the flexibility that I want to have. But, for folks who are in the trenches, like working somewhere like the Daily News, not making six-figure salaries, I think like I want to grab some of those folks who are complaining about the outlook and the present by like the lapels and shake them and say like, join us, like come stand on the line and figure it out. Complaining about it doesn't really do a whole lot.
Right. Well, I will say that Pat did say that he subscribes to the ADN, that he wants the best for the ADN. He wants it to survive. He wants it to continue. I subscribe to the ADN. I think just a point of something that I've been thinking about as I've been working on this series is it's not about the loss of stories. So, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to make some generalizations. And I'd say, like, I think for folks like you and a few others who, maybe Kyle Hopkins, maybe Dermot Cole, maybe Matt Buxton, folks who are kind of like doing their own thing, reporting on their own stories, they don't have a boss telling them exactly what their story should be. That's great. Like we get great, big full-length stories of things that maybe folks weren't tracking. But there is value to someone sending a reporter to committee meetings, to assembly meetings, to school board meetings, having them show up every single time, even if you don't even know if there's going to be a story there, because I think folks behave better when they know the media is watching. And so it's kind of like almost like Big Brother factor. The media served as a big brother when you had all these extra reporters and you could just send them to every meeting. Everything was being monitored and people behaved differently when they knew they were being watched. And so I think one of the things that I think is being lost when you go from a really big staff to like a fraction of that staff is that you no longer have people doing that work.
I accept that, like, sort of, but I think also would like challenge you to sort of point to like what specifically, like what set of meetings like was being covered before and isn't being covered now. Because like I think the ADN and Alaska Public Media, like they're still sending reporters to assembly meetings, like reporters are still showing up to committee hearings at the legislature. I think the place that I actually worry about the most right now is Fairbanks, like, and I actually think like even there, like that newspaper barely exists. Like you open it, there's like maybe one byline story by staff, and then like the only ads in the paper are for the paper, and you're just like, how is this a viable business model? It is owned by a nonprofit, the Sneddon Foundation, but I mean, even that said, like I actually think like, okay, they've definitely lost some of the like frills, but I think like they still get it. Like the one core thing that they do is show up to those meetings. And I mean, I definitely think it's like there are fewer reporters and so there are fewer meetings being covered, but it's also like I think that the people that are still running these legacy news organizations like are fucking ruthless and know exactly what they're doing and where their bread is buttered and what are the most important functions that they serve. And they know that those like public meetings and core government functions are like, that is their raison d'etre. And that's like not, I think, the areas that are being skimped on.
Two things. So number one, Ashley Carrick, who is a representative from Fairbanks, actually had a situation happen where she does a weekly newsletter. It is very labor intensive that she tries to be very informative. And she was actually reporting on issues happening in Fairbanks municipal government where no one else was. And so her newsletter sort of became the source for folks to go back and look at things that were happening. She was breaking news there. So I think you're right on target with Fairbanks lacking some of that. I also just want to point out there's a difference between attending things virtually and attending things in person. And I think that there are some folks who purport to be reporting on Juneau, but don't actually go to Juneau. And that is not the same in this regard that I'm talking about, which is people behaving differently because they know the media is watching. I guess like abstractly, they could know that they could know that someone is watching the gavel to gavel feed and is going to report on it, but it's not the same. And having a reporter in the room, in the front row, sitting there taking notes is much, much more impactful than knowing that a reporter might be watching online and doing a story sometime down in the future.
And way easier to ignore a phone call than it is to ignore someone standing in front of you holding a microphone. But I think I would still stand by what I said, and that I think, yeah, there probably is incrementally more of the like gavel and tuning in, but I'm skeptical that there's been like a momentous change in the amount of like reporters showing up at in-person meetings, like at least in Anchorage and Juneau in the past 10
years. And I want to be clear about something that I might have said explicitly or implied. I don't think that our media environment today is subpar. My fear is that we're not going to hang on to the media that we currently have. And I think, and I've said it a million times, but I think Sean McGuire leaving, Emily Goody-Kuntz leaving, Tom Hewitt leaving, David Hewlin retiring, all of those things happening in a very brief period of time, to me, is a five-alarm fire. It's why I felt like I needed to do some sort of series on the state of media in Alaska, talking about now there's a big problem, and I think we need to be talking about it.
Yeah, I don't know that I would sort of frame it as quite as dire as the way that you're looking at it, but I don't. I mean, especially also with like what we saw in the past week with the rescission of federal funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
I mean, how can you say that, like, with the rescission of federal funding for public broadcasting, that I mean, I think that I'm actually in the five-alarm fire right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think it is worthwhile debating whether it's one alarm fire or three alarm fire or five. Like, that's going to cause big problems in Alaska for absolute sure. But I guess what I would say is, like, we up until that point, actually, like, we had a pretty good thing with public media in Alaska. And I don't, I personally, having reported on the politics of it, like, I didn't expect that rescission package to pass. And honestly, it's like, it's shocking and it's devastating and horrifying, and is really going to result in some momentous shifts in the way that media happens in Alaska, and especially in rural in Alaska, and not for the better.
Hey, well, that gives me an opportunity to mention your podcast, because your most recent podcast guest was Senator Lisa Murkowski. You interviewed her after reconciliation because she talked about it. Specifically said in your interview that she does not refer to it as the one big beautiful bill. It is the reconciliation. But you didn't ask her about the rescission on NPR stuff because it hadn't happened.
No, this was on Sunday, so it had happened, but also she voted against it. She did. Like, Dan Sullivan was the guy to hear from there.
Right. Well, she voted against it, but then she also gave a lot of media about how she felt tricked, and I mean, a lot of people have a lot of feelings right now about Lisa Murkowski. I, as a politician, and I think I'm much, much more sympathetic to the issue of knowing that sometimes you have to vote a way that you don't want to vote because you understand the how the sausage is being made. I think it's very reasonable to believe that Rand Paul was going to be that swing vote if she wasn't going to, and so she just did the best that she could. I think the calculus is a little bit different with the NPR funding. Obviously, she and Susan Collins, so Maine, so your home state, are the only two Republicans that voted against it. Anyway, but I got kind of sidetracked. Anyway, back to you. Northern Journal. So how did you decide what stories you personally were going to focus on once you no longer had somebody telling you what you were going to focus on?
have great privilege in what I do, which is, I think I've been really lucky in my career in Alaska when I was working on staff at places. Like I got to cover a bunch of different stuff. Right? I actually started with the assembly. I started with Anchorage municipal government. I did that for a year. Then I was the Capitol correspondent for like 4 years. Then I worked for Alaska Public Media. I covered sort of energy and environment and climate change for 3 years. So I got to travel to rural Alaska. Went back to the ADN, did kind of politics environment for a little while. And so by the time I started, it was sort of like, okay, I'd covered like all these different institutions and things about our way of life here. And also feel like I'm definitely not Alaska reality TV show level of cred as like an Alaskan who like, you know, kills moose and traps beavers and mines gold. But I think at this point, like I've, developed friendships and relationships where like I know a lot of people across a lot of different like cross sections of the state, sort of geographically and socially and economically, to where like I really like to think that the things that engage and interest me are things that will engage and interest Alaskans broadly. And that's the group that I consider my audience. So I really like, it's really hard because there's only one of me. We do have Max Graham, has a more limited focus of covering the mining industry, but it's just like whatever kind of rises to the top of the list. Obviously, like I have kind of a areas of focus of like energy and environment, and so that kind of often boils down to like fish and oil and gas. But it also kind of gives me leeway to write about like woolly mammoths when they show up on Fish and Game Commissioner Doug Vincent Lang's calendar, or to go cover a dog mushing race in the Kuskokwim watershed when I get invited to do that. And I think that like Alaskans are generally like well-traveled people and interested and engaged people who really appreciate and kind of relish the things that make our state special.
A couple of questions. Like when you get invited to cover a dog race, if you show up and there's other reporters there, do you think, oh, somebody's already got this covered? And I'm just thinking about like when you think about like your lens as a business person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also sometimes will do like a side gig covering Olympic sports, cross country skiing, namely, and have like worked at Olympics and other like huge events where it's like I hate fighting with other reporters over like stories and access, and like I'll do it when I have to. But as an example, well, I'll just sort of say from the top, like my general rule is like, if a story is going to otherwise be written, even if I don't do it, then I don't do it, because like, what's the point? Like, that's exactly the opposite of what I'm here for. I try to do stories that aren't otherwise going to be written if I don't do them. There was an opportunity when we had like 3 Trump cabinet secretaries here a month ago for the Sustainable Energy Conference to like drop $1,000 and wake up at 4 a.m. and go to the North Slope with those cabinet secretaries. But like there was like the ADN was going, there was international media going. I was like, yeah, no thanks. But then there was like another opportunity to drop $1,000 to like fly down to Kenai, get in a helicopter and fly to a oil platform in Cook Inlet with the president of NSTAR and an executive from Fury Hex, the company that was like drilling the well out there. And that was like, yeah, no reporters had that opportunity in like probably literally decades, and it's an essential part of our economy. And hell yeah, that's like a worthwhile investment, and do that in a heartbeat. So that kind of is how I think about that kind
Hey, well, I want to talk about that. You sent me some stories to read, and the one about the Spur platform and just the number of platforms in Cook Inlet that are no longer being used and aren't being taken down. I thought that was a really great story. And I don't know, can you just kind of outline that for us?
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, that was the story that I did when I was on contract for Alaska Public Media. So, there are 17 platforms in Cook Inlet, most of them sunk in the 60s and 70s, like incredible accomplishments of engineering that were built to get oil and gas out of the inlet. Except oil and gas fields do what they do and they decline. And so we've got like, half dozen of these platforms in Cook Inlet that, unless you're in the oil and gas industry, no one really sees, no one really thinks about, but they've literally, as one of the state inspectors described one of them like sitting out there rusting away. And pretty clear from the administrative record that has been a long-standing campaign by the oil industry to not have to spend the tens of millions of dollars that it would take to take them out, and throwing up, what I would honestly summarize as kind of smoke screens, such as, oh, we're going to, turn these into, offshore wind power or tidal power, when the case for that is pretty marginal. And this was sort of something that I think was getting pretty neglected by both the public broadly, but also I think by kind of the regulators like Department of Natural Resources and the Division of Oil and Gas have quite a bit of authority to compel action by companies when they're no longer producing oil and gas, and really have allowed these platforms to sit there for, in some cases, decades going unused. Yeah, it's a fun story.
Well, what's interesting is you write in the article that when oil companies build offshore platforms, they must also agree to restore the public property to the state's satisfaction once they've finished extracting oil and gas. And I couldn't help but make the connection, having listened to your recent podcasts, with the same agreement happening with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, that once the pipeline is done, then it has to be disassembled, taken down. That land has to be restored to what it was before, which I thought was a super interesting podcast because I hadn't really thought about any of that stuff. By the way, I'm going to drop a clip in from that podcast right here. This is from the July 10th episode of Northern Journal podcast. Phil White, an energy historian at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, speaking about the potential income from disassembling the Trans-Alaska Pipeline.
I'm approaching this as a historian of. This is one of the biggest issues that we will face in the future of Alaska. But I think this is fundamentally about promises, right? Promises that were made when the pipeline was constructed between the federal government, the state government, and private corporations. And the promises were, hey, we're going to build this mega project, right? We are going to extract hundreds of billions of dollars worth of oil. And when the end of the life of this economic infrastructure comes to pass, we are going to remediate the lands and the waters of Alaska. And so for me, really, this is about the future of Alaska's sustainable economy, right? By the way, nobody knows the exact lifespan of the pipeline, but we do know that it's a question of when, not if. It will reach the end of its economic life. And when that happens, there are tens of billions of dollars that are at play here for remediating Alaska's lands and waters, for employing tens of thousands of Alaskans. And, I think for me, this is really about making sure that we've learned some of those lessons from the past, and we can chart the brightest possible future for all Alaskans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's like what we can see here close by to Anchorage and Cook Inlet is absolutely a preview of what is going to happen to all this stuff on the North Slope. Like, it is a huge industrial like zone up there, billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure that one day is going to be obsolete, but that basically industry has an incentive to postpone that decommissioning as long as they can, and there are significant and substantial risks to the state that come with allowing companies to do that I listeners can hear more about if they want to read some of my reporting or listening to this podcast.
Hey, and I want to talk about a couple of your other stories. Before we get there, one of the things that I think, if I were in your shoes, would be difficult would be being my own boss and not having a firm deadline for stories that I'm working on. And I wonder how you keep yourself motivated to finish some of these big pieces with lots of moving parts when it would be so easy to, I guess, sit on them longer.
I've got a lot of problems. Like I'm addicted to my phone, and I probably like eat too much pizza, but like sort of motivation for getting work done for whatever reason is never like been a huge problem for me. And I think like sort of the intrinsic motivation of finishing these projects is that if you don't finish them, then no one ever gets to see them. And that's kind of sad. So I don't know. Yeah, it's definitely, I think it is an issue for some. It is an issue for others. That particular one is not an issue for me.
Well, Let me talk about the last skipper in Ozinki.
There has been an enormous loss of access among fishermen in Alaska's coastal and largely indigenous communities of the ownership of the commercial permits that are required to be a commercial fisherman. Some of that, I think, very clearly comes with like industrial trends, like consolidation of the processing industry, globalization of the seafood industry as well. But I think clearly there is a significant and substantial impact from the privatization of the permits, the access itself. And in the 70s, the state, kind of advised by these like neoliberal economists, made the decision to only allow a finite number of fishermen in these like really lucrative salmon harvests. And so if you were fishing at that time, you were kind of grandfathered in. But if you weren't, if you were a father that had 6 kids and you got one permit, you had to decide which of your kids is getting a permit, and the other one has to like find tens of thousands of dollars to buy a permit, also buy a boat. And it created, what I think arguably are today, like some real inequities where you have communities literally next to the fisheries where people can't afford to buy in, and they can't sort of afford the level of like intense capitalization that you need to be a commercial fisherman and own all the stuff. And this is kind of a social problem that's been like really exhaustively documented in academia. It's been kind of run through the legislature by various efforts, most recently through former Sitka Democratic Representative Jonathan Christ-Tompkins. But ultimately, it's sort of a problem that I think Alaskans, by and large, up until recently, when there's been a little bit more political energy going into it, have otherwise kind of contented themselves to say the incumbent, like status quo fishermen, they're doing fine. We don't really need to take care of these folks in rural Alaska. And the goal was really to kind of show this problem in a little bit more of like a human-centered light, and sort of as exemplified by this guy who, grew up in a fishing family, in a fishing community, where now he is like 70 plus years old and the only real kind of commercial fishing skipper left.
I'll tell you what was impressive. So you interviewed Jonathan Christ-Tompkins, the Democratic legislator from Sitka, who had tried to find a legislative fix. You interviewed the current Speaker of the House, Bryce Edgman from Dillingham, who's very aware of this issue and the need for a remedy. But the part that I was really impressed with was you interviewed Terry Gardner, who was the representative from Ketchikan, who 50 years ago was in the legislature when they initially instituted this policy in the first place. And you were able to talk about not only the different options that they explored and why those options couldn't be utilized, but how this was what they believed was the best option at the time. And basically sort of acknowledgement from somebody who was created the solution with the fact that the solution didn't work. And I love that. I love that that's sort of like full spectrum reporting going into it.
We're lucky that the span of Alaska's statehood and history is such that some of those that were there at the beginning are still around now. I definitely was very grateful when I found out that Terry Gardner wasn't dead.
Well, because he was so young when he got elected at age 22.
Yep.
Hey, so one more story I want to talk about. The most recent one, the one that you did with ProPublica. So 2 questions about that. So this is the title of the article is How a Risky State Investment in Seafood Costs Alaskans Millions and Left a Fishing Town in Crisis. But it's got a double byline. So it's Hal Burton from ProPublica and Nathaniel Herz, Northern Journal. So first thing about when you have, and I think I've always seen this with ProPublica, there's 2 authors. How do you divide up the work and how does that work?
I don't have like a really compelling answer for that, other than that it was sort of like who had time for what, and we each wrote sections based on kind of our reporting, and we each did reporting based on kind of our relationship and our strengths. And I think that's, I think different places will do that differently, but I don't think that would be considered an unusual arrangement.
I apologize that I hadn't followed this story that closely when it happened. This is an amazing piece of work. Can you just thumbnail sketch like what the story is about and what it's covering?
Yeah, and this was sort of a story that I covered like iteratively as it played out, but wanted more depth on. I mean, basically, this was when the Permanent Fund, I think, made what was a very well publicized and reported like push into investing money inside the state, specifically kind of carved out and directed in a way that was really questioned, like, was this money just going to go to politically connected folks? And one of the investments was into the seafood company with a sort of very colorful, I think I would dare say, well, I'll just say colorful business partner who had sort of a pretty interesting business history.
Mr.
And,
May, what's his first name?
Yeah, Roger May. And you
Roger
know,
May.
His record included like criminal stuff, criminal,
like selling spoiled salmon to prisons and having it fed to prisoners and making them very sick.
Correct. And you know, there were some sort of explanations of that, but nonetheless, like the stuff that in sort of what you would expect to be standard corporate due diligence to pop up. And then basically huge amount of state money, tens of millions of dollars went into this investment. And it went bad in a way that like left fishermen unpaid. And this one town, King Cove on the Alaska Peninsula, where the fish processing plant is like the linchpin of the economy, the plant was like shut down and remains shut down. And it was like, how did this happen? And are we not going to have some more accountability for the fact that like this didn't just happen through the result of like ruthless capitalists and private equity bros going in and doing a deal? It was like, we literally did this to ourselves. Like this was our money that like we lost and went into a deal that like not only we lost all the money, but we like maybe kneecapped like an entire community that now maybe is going to ask for a state bailout. And so it had been one that I was like, I don't have the bandwidth for this. And ProPublica had been interested in freelance commission. And so they hired me. We did it as sort of a published Northern Journal. ProPublica, Anchorage Daily News sent a photographer, Mark Lester, out to King Cove with the other freelancer, Hal Burton, who's actually also a longtime ADN and Seattle Times reporter. They went to King Cove. And so we all worked together to produce that story. And I think most of the stories I gave you as examples, like, you know, that was really more of an example of like, look, here's how sort of collaboration can get to a place of like getting a story that like I might not have the bandwidth to do myself or the resources to spend thousands of dollars to get out to King Cove. But like when you put ProPublica's like financial resources, editing capacity, ADN's in-state footprint and photographer, and like my specialized kind of experience covering the fishing industry, then you actually can do stuff like that. And so I just think it's sort of an example of like, we got to get creative, and not to say that story was like a silver bullet or accomplished anything special, but we got to a place that's hard to get to and shared some new information about stuff that people didn't already have.
Right. Well, and there's a philosophical issue that was brought up in it, which was about the Permanent Fund choosing to invest in Alaskans by using McKinley Capital as sort of the middleman to find Alaska projects to invest in. And you talked about it about the Permanent Fund Board saying that they felt it would have been political suicide to vote against picking the Alaskan capital company as opposed to the more well-respected, national firm. And from an outsider's perspective, somebody who's like not like a banker, I'm like, well, that makes sense. We should pour our money into Alaskans and invest in Alaskans. And this is like a story that shows just how badly choosing to vote for the Alaskan over and over again can go.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the issue there was not necessarily so much that it was like the Alaskan firm versus the non-Alaskan firm, but it was an Alaska firm that had experience doing sort of trading stocks and bonds like on a stock market, but not like buying existing mature businesses and restructuring them to make more profits. And that was, I think, where there was a real issue here, in that McKinley this was their kind of first entry into that realm, and they didn't have experience. And I think, it showed here.
Right. Well, and you did a really good job of pointing out that the way that these sorts of capital investments should work is that you take a struggling company, you put capital into it, you make it extraordinarily profitable, and then you sell it for a big profit. And that McKinley Capital had never done something like this. And that there's a specific skill set that's required to make that work. And that the permanent fund chose somebody to do something that they'd never done before and didn't have the skill set to do.
Which isn't like totally unprecedented. Like in some ways, like in the industry, they kind of see that as like, well, maybe they have, they have the geographic experience in Alaska. Maybe they'll find some deals that other folks would have seen because they don't know Alaska. But I think in this case, it did not prove to pay off.
I think the one question I'd also ask is there were a lot of folks speaking off the record, a lot of confidential sources in that story. Do you feel like that there's any difference in the way you manage confidential sources as somebody who's more of an independent contractor than somebody who's working for a big media organization?
Yeah, I mean, and I think in that case, like it's a little bit about the subject matter too, where it's like as you get into more businessy shit, like it's harder to get people to speak on the record because they're not public officials, and it's like that's not necessarily like an expectation or part of their job. I think like my work, generally speaking, it's not a never or a can't do it, but it's really like it requires a super compelling reason to do it or a special circumstance. And I just think it's like I've gotten by my entire career almost never doing it. And not that there aren't cases where it's honestly imperative, but like almost always there's like a document or some other way of like bringing the stuff from an anonymous sort of source like onto the record or into like a more reliable, authoritative source. So that's kind of how I'll approach it.
And I think my last question in this vein is when you worked for the ADN or you worked for Alaska Public Media, it's my assumption that if President Trump were going to sue you for your coverage, that he would be suing the media organization and not Herz. But when you're Northern Journal is sort of your baby and you're sort of functioning as a freelancer, do you worry about you yourself personally being sued? And do you have, I don't know, do you get insurance or how does that work?
Yes, is the short answer to all those questions. I do worry about it. I'm actually being sued for libel and defamation right now for like $4 million. It's a matter of public record. You can look that up in court view. It's for a story that was published when I was working with Alaska Public Media, and so they're handling the defense. I will say they have insurance, but even when you are insured, being sued is not something I would recommend and takes up an extraordinarily large amount of time. And I do not have libel insurance for Northern Journal, namely right now because I'm actively in litigation and I'm not expecting that I would be able to get an affordable policy. I've been quoted policies at like $5,000, but when this case is over, it sort of was something I was sort of waiting to do until I was making enough money. But it's like I think it is suicidal in this kind of environment if you're going to be writing hard stories not to be protected, and that is a sort of longstanding issue for some of the kind of more like new age independent newsletter type folks. Like Substack has a program where they offer legal defense to some of the kind of best-selling authors that they work with. I left Substack. One of the reasons I didn't stick with them was because Substack got to make the decision about whether they would defend you. It wasn't sort of guaranteed, but huge sort of, I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night, mostly because when I am working a really hard story these days, like I'm usually doing it in partnership with someone else. And there's usually pre-publication review by a lawyer to make sure that we're not going to libel someone. And I will say we had that in the case of the story that is now the subject of this lawsuit. And it's probably all I will say about that. But
well, I will ask, like, you're familiar with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press?
Yeah, we actually applied to them several years ago as Alaska Press Club for a grant to have a reporter that was working specifically in Alaska on issues of media law. We did not get that grant.
Well, I was just curious, since I have, like, they're my most recent podcast. They say that they are the leading provider of pro bono legal services for journalists in the country. but something that I couldn't really ask him as somebody who's representing that organization is like, how often do you say no? How often are you not able to provide legal services, and under what circumstances? I mean, like, is it like, do you only provide legal services when it's a slam dunk and this is going to be easy, or do you provide legal services even when it's a little bit murkier? Do you know?
Yeah. And I mean, RCFP, like, I think they're very well known and they do like essential work, and there is like there are media lawyers out there and there's pro bono work that happens. I think there's also sort of an acknowledgement in the industry right now that like this is a void, and that sort of legal protections and legal work to support garden variety reporting, let alone like investigative reporting, is like needed. And RCFP, I think, has received some philanthropic money, but I also think like there are still some big holes. Like, we don't have a great infrastructure for it here in Alaska. That's definitely like one area where I think Alaska Press Club it's something that we're kind of aware of and thinking about and would like to actively be working on, because it's not, I don't want to overstate it. It's not like I'm dealing with like legal threats every day of my life, but like I'm dealing with legal threats occasionally, and I'm also dealing regularly with like issues of access to public records that also could like really use legal support, and like I don't have it, and so I don't, like, for free, and so I don't use it in the way that I would if I had it for free or at a discount, or folks that I was collaborating with more regularly. And if I did, I would use it and I would get more stuff and write more stories.
So I know that like the statute that provides a shield for reporters in Alaska is from like 1967. It's my understanding that it hasn't really been amended or changed or updated since 1967. Do you think there's room for legislation to help reporters in Alaska?
I think that the public records statute is, one, way out of date, and two, completely grossly abused by the Department of Law. And I think in ways that could use some oversight, and also like there's some obvious opportunities for legislative reform. One thing that is completely absurd that the Department of Law does is that anytime you ask for like copies of email correspondence in like in possession of a state employee, they're like, this is not a request for a public record, and so we don't have a deadline to give this to you in 10 days. It's a request for quote unquote electronic services and products, which we characterize as like functional access to a alphanumeric system or whatever. And they're like, we'll just process that in the way that we want to. And like, you also have to define like the specific subject that like you're asking for, and we don't have to give you records that you weren't looking for that you might have asked for. And the most egregious abuses of that, or the stuff that's most urgent, like I will go to the mat. The stuff that is not often gets dropped. And I know that other reporters like really deal with that. So I think that, yes, I think we probably could use a better shield law here, although I think like that is less of an issue here than it is maybe in other states where you have even more contentious relationships between like business and politics and all that.
So speaking of something we kind of talked about when you mentioned that there's definitely more space in the podcast world for podcasts like mine, do you have advice for anyone who's thinking of starting an independent news platform similar to Northern Journal, and like how they would get started and how they would go about it?
I mean, the tools are there, like just do it, like I think people can get intimidated or really want to focus on like doing something that's perfect. And I think just like doing the thing. And if the thing is something that is interesting and important to people, it doesn't matter if you forgot to capitalize or if your sound quality is like not the greatest, and I think you probably found that. The thing that I really like also want to like say, and that I think I want us to be thinking about as we're thinking about like the future of media in Alaska, is like, I think one of the greatest kind of long-standing failures that we have as like an industry and as a business in Alaska is like, you look at me, you look at my employee at Northern Journal, you look at the reporting staffs of most of the places around the state, like they're largely made up of white people who like grew up elsewhere. And Alaska has like such rich and diverse cultural traditions, unique institutions, weird stuff that you only know if you're an Alaskan or someone who's been here for a long time. Like that's an area where I think like we need more creativity and visioning, like being brought to bear with, I think creating and reimagining like old and new media institutions and organizations to bring more traditionally like underrepresented perspectives and communities like into the practice of journalism. That's definitely something like we put a not totally insignificant amount of time and energy into at Alaska Press Club and sort of developing fellowship programs and just sort of thinking about this stuff a little bit more directly. But like I think as we think about like what is it that is going to get people more bought into media in Alaska, and particularly places that aren't invested in media right now, like people need to see themselves in their communities being like represented in the media in Alaska. And I think like that's not a knock on the people that are doing journalism in Alaska today or the organizations that are doing it. It's just that like I think while there are huge structural challenges and problems that we face, like there are also opportunities there. And like we should be thinking about those opportunities as we try to like navigate and negotiate these challenges too.
Did you want to mention Alaska Center for Excellence in Journalism? Because you sent me the link.
Yeah, I mean, I just, that's one example of homegrown Alaska sort of initiative and effort like being brought to bear on like what is a whole in Alaska media right now. It's like folks don't necessarily have like the money to commission freelancers or to travel to a remote location. Like we funded Max Graham, my colleagues travel out to multiple places in remote Alaska that allowed us to tell stories that otherwise would have like gone untold that we thought were pretty like significant and important stories. And, they're funding other efforts right now, like a sort of legislative reporters exchange, I think. And I would also say like Alaska Press Club is an enormously positive force here in Alaska as well, sort of trying to kind of fill holes and creatively solve problems for newsrooms. There's also like an effort in Southeast, among sort of small newspaper publishers in Alaska.
I hear exactly what you're saying about trying to like have more homegrown journalists reporting on their home communities that they know best. What's interesting is how Tom Hewitt, I don't know if you listened to his interview, did you?
Not yet, but I will.
Well, if you listen to the very beginning, because it's my teaser, because it was just such a crazy way of putting it, he literally makes a plea with listeners. He said, look, you're going to be disappointed in the news coverage here. And the reason why is that these are new reporters who just got here and they're doing the best that they can, but they don't have years of background knowledge. They don't know the history and they're doing the best they can. And you're going to be disappointed. And I ask you to be patient and I ask you to continue to subscribe.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the reporters that do like the work that's like most meaningful in Alaska. It's like, I mean, Kyle Hopkins grew up in rural Alaska to parents, I think, who were like teachers or school administrators. He went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's like spent his entire career here. He knows rural Alaska. He knows urban Alaska. Like he knows what is important. Like it's not an accident that he does journalism on like the subjects that like resonate and matter the most to Alaskans. And I feel lucky that I've been able to be here long enough that I have at least like a vague sense of some of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's hard. And the sort of structural things that you described at the beginning here of not being able to pay people enough to like stay in the industry when you have kids, like that's all real. And those are like, if we want journalism that really reflects the place and kind of meets the challenges that we have, like we got to solve those problems. But I have some optimism that we're working on it and we're getting there.
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to say it out loud because Tom says it in the interview. But, one of the reasons why he was able to stay at the ADN so long is that his wife made enough money and then they got a divorce. And so he had to leave the ADN because he couldn't afford it anymore. And I think everyone heard it in the Pat Doherty interview when he says that he was working at the Alaska Advocate, that he was like, well, I worked there for 2 years and I didn't get paid. And I was like, how do you support yourself? He's like, well, my girlfriend and later wife paid for everything. And I mean, it's kind of like when you look at legislatures in the country that don't pay a decent salary, you end up with folks who have rich spouses or retirees. I don't really see a lot of retirees going into journalism, but I mean, like, you just end up with a very different population of people who are able to do it for so little money. And yeah, I don't know if there's any state that has subsidized its poured money into its journalism industry. But
I don't think that's what we need to have to make it work. I think it's like the money, like, okay, if there needs to be more money and people need to be paid competitive salaries, like that money doesn't it's not, there are other sources of funding there. We as a society, like, sort of have to decide, like, do we value the information and the journalism enough that, like, we're willing to pay for it and pay for it in a way that it's going to, like, keep people working at salaries that, like, are competitive, and we're not there now. That said, like, I'm making the money that I need to make. I think ADN reporters, they could make more money. I don't think we're that far away. Like, the Beacon, I think, pays its reporters pretty well, and they have pretty good benefits. So it's like, yeah, we need more money there. And, like, where does that come from? How do we do it? Is that sort of nonprofit funding? Is that financiers, like, subsidizing losses or what? Like, but there are options there, different business models, whatever it is.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you wanted to recommend a book.
I'll just recommend that the one that I did the podcast on, the new biography of Captain Cook, in which you will learn that the islands in Prince William Sound that, like, people travel to and hunt at all the time, Montague and Hinchinbrook, are, like, named for the country estate of Captain Cook's patron in the Admiralty, the Earl of Sandwich. Hampton Sides, I think it's called The Wide, Wide Sea. Captain Cook's sort of influential figure in the kind of colonization of Alaska and initial sort of Western mapping of Alaska was one that really engaged me.
Yeah, and you interviewed the author on June 3rd, so people can check out your podcast as well, also called Northern Journal. Well, Nat Herz, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I am including links in the show notes to the articles and podcast episodes discussed on today's show. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklag.gov or call 907-269-0123.